Today's speaker is Ben Linville-Engler, the Industry and Certificate Director for the System Design and Management Program. In this role, he establishes strategic industry partnerships, identifies industry trends, and teaches medical device and project-based courses to help students and partner companies develop new technologies, products, and leaders. Prior to MIT, Ben worked for over a decade in medical device product, capability, team, and origination development. Ben is an alumnus of the System Design and Management program and studied mechanical engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. His talk today is titled Ecosystem Engineering, Mobilizing a Statewide Manufacturing Response to COVID-19. If you have questions for the presenter, please enter them into the chat window at the side of the video. They will be addressed during the Q&A portion of this session. Additionally, the recording of this presentation will be available online after today's session. A link will be sent to all registrants. It will also be available here on SDM's YouTube channel. And with that, Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get things started. Excited to share with all of you a little bit of the work that I've been doing the past year. And I'll just briefly give an introduction to myself and some of the background that I had in the medical device space and how it came to be quite useful over the past year in response to the pandemic. But really want you to think about, as we go through this, you know, some of what you as alumni from SDM have learned and how you may be able to apply those learnings to, you know, real world ongoing events outside of maybe your industry or your normal day jobs, especially during crisis situations. And I promise, you know, after all of this, you'll see definitely the power of networking and relationship development amongst many other topics. As Naomi mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about ecosystem engineering and really a lot of the effort that has gone on here in Massachusetts to mobilize a statewide manufacturing response to COVID-19. And the topic of ecosystem engineering, the way to think about that is a lot of the activities that might typically go on under one firm and how those activities can expand to an ecosystem, especially during this crisis. So a little bit about myself. In 2018, the Washington Post had an article that evaluated the most recent Google Maps data to identify the most remote towns in the US for metropolitan areas. I happen to be from number 8, Holcomb, Kansas. I actually grew up on a farm about 30 minutes outside number 8. And I think for me, you know, some of the reflections I've had, you know, throughout my life, but especially during this, is what characteristics maybe did I learn on the farm that have helped in this. And a lot of it has to do with collaboration. Also, when you live in a place that remote and you want to do certain things, you need to do a lot of planning. And also how to be resourceful and utilize resources that might be scarce. My family is a Deere family, so if we have any of our John Deere alum on here, I hope that I'm in good company. But after growing up in the farm in the top left there, as you can see indicated in the red circle, I moved to Colorado where I did my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Colorado and got an emphasis in biomedical engineering as well as biochemistry. And so I was really interested at the intersection of not just engineering, but the life sciences. And I then started to work in the bottom right-hand corner for a global medical device company called Applied Medical. And what each of these flags indicates is a building on their campus in Southern Orange County that has some level of manufacturing in it. And one of the things I was really interested in joining the company was their vertical integration. And that really provided me an opportunity to not only learn the early stage design, maybe research side of medical devices, but what does it ultimately take to commercialize and bring a product to market at scale? And then I had an opportunity to take those learnings in Orange County and then spend a few years in the Netherlands office for Applied Medical to help start some new capabilities in the company there for engineering, product development, manufacturing, service, and some other things. I ultimately left Applied Medical after serving in roles as Vice President of Product Development, Technology Development, and Engineering, and came into the SDM program in 2016 as a fellow. And I'll briefly just talk about one of the major initiatives that I worked on at Applied Medical was building out the embedded systems division. The company had historically been primarily focused on mechanical instruments and access devices. And so this was a big shift in terms of both technology, but product development processes for medical electrical equipment. So it wasn't just about the technology and the product, but organizationally what was required to help bring this new system to the market in a regulated environment. And this system required both an equipment aspect to it, but then also a number of hand instruments that were customized based off of the types of procedures that were going to be occurring, both minimally invasive abdominal procedures, as well as head and neck procedures and open abdominal procedures as well. And so this was really my, I would say, first foray into complex system design. And as I mentioned, in a regulated space by the FDA, there's an incredible amount of risk management and product user safety that goes into this, and a large amount of traceability on decisions and how that maps through the entire product lifecycle. So that was something that for me, I really had a great opportunity to not just learn those processes, but also help to implement those in an established company, which I think helped give me a lot of perspective that I was able to bring to this crisis response. While at MIT, I was really interested in filling some gaps that I had, or at least I felt that I had, both on the engineering technical side, but also the business side. So SDM as a joint program was a great fit for me. This is just a little bit of an overview of some of the things I looked to focus on while I was on campus, but want to highlight a few as they really do pertain to the crisis response. And so, you know, across courses and thesis work, co-curricular activities, professional and networking and volunteer activities there on the bottom, I was really interested in digital health, biotech, life sciences, entrepreneurship and innovation, leadership and organizational studies, and then sort of just a catch-all other bucket. And these are a number of the activities that I participated in, but some of the ones I'm highlighting here have a lot to do with the life sciences and med device activities in the greater Boston area, which require actually a lot of networking. And so over the last 4+ years that I've been in the greater Boston area, I've had an opportunity to connect with people across MIT, the health systems, the entrepreneurship ecosystem, a number of other business leaders as well. And I feel like that really enabled me to leverage those relationships here as we get into the manufacturing response. But a couple that I really want to highlight, and I'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the talk, have to do with some of my thesis work in combination with Professor Repenning's knowledge work design and some of what the Broad Institute has done around testing on how that kind of came to connection in a lot of this. If you want to read more about my experience at MIT, there's a blog at the MIT Innovation Initiative that talks about some of these opportunities that I was able to pursue. But one of the things for me in going through the MIT ecosystem that is really kind of a bookend to the work that I'm going to talk about here coming up is identified a gap that I felt the current MIT entrepreneurship ecosystem doesn't necessarily address for specifically medical device startup companies. And that has a lot to do with quality management and risk management and how integral those are in both the organization operations of a company, but also the product or system development aspects of that. And oftentimes those are left kind of till the end and they become overburdensome. And so last year during IAP in 2020, I started a course, a short course to really look at these aspects and help to introduce students and others in the ecosystem to not just product development practices, but how quality management and risk management really need to integrate into those activities, not just from a product standpoint, but from an organization standpoint. Last year in 2020, we had about 40 students join. I just ran this course again this last week. We had about 100 students join. And really from January 2020 to this year, I've really been exercising all of this on repeat as part of this manufacturing emergency response. A couple of concepts that most of you are familiar with, but for those of you that aren't, I'll be talking a lot about systems thinking, and in the context of COVID, it's very much about human connectedness and connected design, especially in terms of a response of public health. But for me, a lot of it is really a way of learning. The value in relationships and connections and interfaces is really important. And I started with those maps of the places that I was from. And Kansas and Colorado, Southern California and the Netherlands. And a lot of it to me, those places all look very different, but the people and the relationships and support that I had in those areas is very similar across those different geographies. So there's a lot of value in relationships and connections, not just between people, but between people and technologies, infrastructure, et cetera. And a lot of the behavioral aspects of a system happen because of those relationships and how they interact together. So a way in which I conceptualize this is a quote from Steve Jobs: "Creativity is just connecting things." When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. That's because they were able to connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things. And so to me, the word create and, bringing new things to life from nothing has a lot to do with connecting people, technologies, et cetera. And what I think you'll find as we get into this talk, a lot of this has to do with relationships between individuals that ultimately went on to create some really great work in responding to COVID. In systems engineering, for those of you maybe practitioners of this, you're very familiar with this, but more that on systems engineering is integrating a wide range of disciplines into a team effort, not just looking solely at technical needs, but also business needs. And typically there's a structured development process, and that could be, a standard V model or agile, but then also thinking about how to address risks and uncertainty throughout the life cycle. And a few keywords that I'll mention throughout this talk are things like form, function, and frequency. And for me, frequency, I use that as a bit of a catch-all for time-related things. Could be time-related logic, could be life cycles, et cetera. But I'll come back to that as we get into the talk. And for this one, especially with things that are time-related, is I like a quote by Jeff Bezos: "I don't try to strike a balance, I try to find the right harmony." And for me, balance over time is harmony. And so there's going to be certain times where things aren't necessarily balanced in that static view, but over time, right, how do you integrate these things together over that, say, life cycle, et cetera, to ultimately find the harmony of what you're looking for. So now to get into it, I'm going to talk a lot today about the Massachusetts Manufacturing Emergency Response Team, or MERT. And to start with, I have a short video introduction by some of the people I've been fortunate to meet and work with through this. So bear with me as I just change the audio settings, but this will be about 2 minutes long.
There were two nightmares. One was we wouldn't have enough ventilators. I'm the physician in chief here, and my patients would die. That was the first problem. And urgency number two is that we wouldn't have enough of this stuff because we were in short supply and we were running through it really quickly. And so I would be sending my people in to situations where they were going to get infected.
The number of reported cases, as everybody knows, has seen a significant uptick in the United States and in Massachusetts, and state health officials are closely monitoring and tracing presumptive positive cases.
So as this cascading crisis happened, our phone just started ringing off the hook. Put out an email to about 35 people. 50 people showed up on the Zoom call, and we said we need a manufacturing response to this crisis.
The notion of the federal stockpile was it's supposed to be our stockpile.
The states have been put in a position, especially with PPE, where they have to compete. I think we're quite fortunate here in Massachusetts. We have world-class health systems. We have world-class academic centers and companies with a lot of technical expertise. And we have a lot of manufacturing capability that exists. We were able to activate all of that in parallel very quickly.
So I think, that is a great introduction to sort of the state of things in early March here in the Commonwealth. And as Dr. Zeidel mentioned, one of the big concerns of our leading health systems was that they were not going to have enough PPE and other materials to protect their workers, but also as this continues to unfold, ultimately treat a lot of these patients. And so in March, about March 20th, the first meeting of the MERT was called, and I'll talk more about the WHO and the stakeholders involved here. But this was at a time when we had, tens of cases per day here in Massachusetts. If you remember back to late February, there was a biotech conference that seemed to accelerate a lot of the spread across the state. And we really pulled together here this group of people on March 20th, looking at what we could do to respond to the crisis from a manufacturing standpoint. If you're not familiar with the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, this is an economic development agency that's part of the Baker administration, and they have a number of initiatives going on, but the one that we were really anchored on in this effort was their Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative, which has been around for roughly 10 years with a lot of activity in the last 5. And what I'll mention about that is that we weren't starting from zero. So here in the Commonwealth, from a manufacturing standpoint, we might have been caught flat-footed, but we at least had our shoes on. And so there was a lot of trust that was already existing that we could start to activate and leverage. People already knew each other. We were also able to pull in clinical expertise from Beth Israel Lahey and Mass General Brigham. And this Advanced Manufacturing Collaborative had manufacturers that maybe had done medical devices in the past, but also a lot who previously had not ever manufactured for the medical device industry. It also included other academic institutions like UMass Lowell, WPI. We also worked with folks from Lincoln Labs, as well as AFOA, which is the Advanced Functional Fabrics of America. It's a Manufacturing USA Institute. So as we started to pull all these stakeholders together, right, one of the things that's really important is how are you going to actually interact and communicate? And how I originally got involved with this is that I had connected with Professor John Hart from Mechanical Engineering on a community response project for a group that was trying to convert a snorkel mask to a respirator. And like most folks these days that are working virtually, we jumped on Slack. And Hayden Quinlan, who's his program manager for the Advanced Production Technology Center at MIT, we started getting together, quickly talking about what it was that we needed to pull together from a resource standpoint. And Hayden kicked off this indexing survey to really look at what were the capabilities and capacity of manufacturers across the Commonwealth. And so COVID-19 created a very clear mission amongst all these people, but it did so with a very different set of vocabulary. Part of my thesis, I looked at this idea of boundary objects and understanding differences between syntax, semantics, and understanding really these transformative processes. And the more distance you have in expertise, the larger opportunity there is for miscommunication. And so in this case, very much so at the beginning, there's a large gap between what's going on the front line with clinicians and then ultimately what's going on with folks like myself from an engineering background. I was fortunate enough to have a lot of clinical exposure when I was working for Applied Medical, but this was a very new situation. And so there was a lot of learning that needed to happen. And I feel like with medical devices, there's this gap that exists between the person designing the tool and maybe the person using the tool that maybe doesn't always exist the same in other industries. I know more aerospace engineers that are pilots than I know, mechanical engineers that are surgeons or physicians. And so a large exercise here was how do we get everybody speaking the same language and thinking about PPE really as this boundary object. And so that's how this was sort of ad hoc organized. And we really wanted to pull together inputs that were going to give us the information we needed to actually respond. So a lot of my role went into this FDA regulator and CDC interface. I was able to open up a direct weekly line of communication with the FDA's All Hazards Response Director, which led to oftentimes daily or multi-daily calls with different product leads. We had the clinical specialists from some of the leading health institutions here in Massachusetts, a lot of technical input from other academics, engineers, and manufacturers. And then we were constantly getting more input from manufacturers on their capabilities, capacities, what supplies were available. And then we were really also learning a lot about what was it that was needed from a demand standpoint. So this buyer perspective, not just from the state, but other entities as well. And really working to make this as a cohesive process so that we were getting new information and sharing it and making sure everybody understood what this new perspective or information meant. So we were meeting 3 times a week. We were often communicating via email and Slack at all hours of the day. to try to make sure that we were getting the latest information to everyone as fast as possible. And when there were misalignments, that we could meet as a group and quickly talk through them from these different perspectives. So there's a process something called systems leadership from the Harvard Kennedy School that I think this very much embodies. You know, from the individual standpoint, there's skills of collaborative leadership that enable trust building and empower action among stakeholders. The community, we had state support for this, so there was a lot of coalition building and advocacy that I'll talk about. And then the system itself, right? What's the understanding of this complex system that we're trying to shape and understand the challenge that we're addressing? And I think that's where a lot of my background from the medical device industry, as well as experience that was coming from our manufacturers and many others, really went into providing a view of what we were working on as quickly as possible. For those of you that aren't familiar with the medical device commercialization process, this is a stakeholder value representation of what we were really trying to harmonize as we were going through this. So here in the center is a responding entity that's maybe producing PPE. And you can see that they have to manage a lot of different inputs and outputs, things like monetary capital, knowledge capital, physical capital like products or components, and then compliance constraints. And so not all of these are sort of activated simultaneously. However, it's really important to understand how these may be changing dynamically, especially in this crisis situation. And so we had input coming in from health systems, state emergency management agency, and other care sites around what products, what was the demand for different PPE, but then also working with care providers to really understand how they were using PPE and making sure there was alignment there. The FDA was issuing a lot of emergency use authorizations and enforcement policies during March, April, and May. And so keeping up with those to ensure that we were testing what we needed to test. And then there was bottlenecks in certified body testing, as well as suppliers that I'll talk about. So really trying to figure out how to harmonize all this information, and in this case, in a very condensed timeline, really required a high level of communication and a high level of collaboration. And we also needed to prioritize, right? So when all of this was happening in early March and April, it was really like a collision of many networks, right? We have a really robust health system network here, really robust academic network, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of tech companies. And so all of these individual networks were colliding. And so there were times where you'd have an engineer talking to a physician, but neither of them knew like what type of engineer were you or what type of physician were you, right? And so there was an aspect of kind of quality of information that you were getting. And so we were really looking at how do we coordinate to ensure that we are addressing the most urgent frontline problems without overburdening frontline workers, right? If everybody is going to ask people what they need, it might become a distraction, or we might not be asking the right questions. And at the same time, how do we not overburden suppliers? And I'll talk about this a little more as we get to some of the face shield aspects of the response. And so then as we start to look at this, how do we also stage and coordinate resources to ensure we produce safe and effective solutions at scale? And so we were looking at what maximum impact could we have, and in this case, it's volume of FDA compliant supplies with as little effort as possible. And in this case, little effort still means a lot of effort, but maybe not as much as a really high effort starting from, say, 0. And then how do we prioritize these and ultimately get them through a life cycle process? So this is a high level view of sort of this process that we were undergoing. We were really looking at reducing uncertainties simultaneously in needs and demand, external factors like those regulatory requirements, the coupling of this economic fallout from the pandemic, leadership issues, and then also the capability and capacity of manufacturers. And some of these were very much interrelated. And so we had teams that were focused in each of these areas, which I'll talk about coming up. But then how do you combine that with this stakeholder cohesion and communication, a product system lifecycle? And we were fortunate enough here that the state was able to pull together some funding to help support this effort. And again, we were really focused on the first surge, which initially was expected to hit between April 10th and April 20th. So we had, 3 to 4 weeks that we were really targeting to get as much of this out as possible. And in that time, we were able to help 50 plus companies pivot. And again, these aren't necessarily medical device manufacturing companies. We were supporting the MIT Project Manus face shield design and some of their regulatory aspects of that. But then there were companies that you may have heard of from the apparel industry like Brooks Brothers or New Balance. One that I like to talk about is Love Pop, who during normal times makes greeting cards. And I bought many of these before the pandemic, but they were able to both pivot some of their manufacturing, but find new resources to help produce isolation gowns at pretty large scale. And this sort of realization process that we were helping to move all of these companies through from kind of a new company perspective, right, or a new product perspective, is really thinking about new technology development. What then does it take to bring and commercialize the product and bring it to market? And in the medical device space, and this comes from that course that I teach during IAP, is there's a large inflection point, and oftentimes it's experienced as a step change if you're not familiar with it, for quality system and regulatory controls. And again, a lot of these aren't just on the product, but they're on the organization. What was going on during the crisis is the FDA was putting out guidance on a per product basis that was really looking at a risk to benefit analysis of these products to say, what can we reduce in terms of regulatory burden that can help more manufacturers get product to the market without reducing the benefit and introducing more risk than is necessary. And so they were issuing these emergency use authorizations and emergency enforcement policies to help create sort of this reduced endpoint for manufacturers that were pivoting their operations. And this was what I was helping to identify and communicate to our manufacturers on almost a daily basis. So when we look at all of this coming together across a product life cycle and supply chain, there's a simplified diagram of a product life cycle, and it looks like a straight line. This is very much an iterative process, but we had sub-teams from the M-ERT that were really focused on needs and demand and coordinating with the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. We had a team that was really looking for new novel designs. However, again, with the speed at which we were trying to move and what the Frontline was really needing, it wasn't necessarily new innovative products, although some of those were created. We were really looking at impact by volume to get them the protection that they needed. I was leading the regulatory and testing team that was really feeding into what we needed to verify and validate from an FDA standpoint, how that fed into quality control for manufacturing processes, and then also looking at how that could impact reprocessing or servicing to maybe extend the life cycle of certain products. We also had a team then that really helped to identify and connect with these manufacturers and think about the supply chains for materials that they were using. And then also on this distribution piece was working with MEMA on some of what they were doing from a sourcing standpoint. There were a number of regulations that went into place from the FDA that impacted the importation of PPE. N95 respirators, folks are quite familiar with. So we were also then utilizing some of this information to help them think about how to do, in a way, incoming inspection and improve the confidence that we might have in certain materials. And this cut across a lot of different product types. Things like face shields, a lot of companies were able to pivot to very quickly and early on. Isolation gowns, both disposable and reusable. We had a large effort, which I'll talk about in more detail, about nasopharyngeal swabs, as well as surgical masks and general use masks, disinfectants and hand sanitizers, N95 masks, which I mentioned we were doing testing on these for imported masks or donated masks so that the state could have more confidence in which masks or other materials they should be distributing first. And then we also were working on ventilators, and not so much on making a ventilator from scratch, but thinking about for the life cycle, how could we extend the life cycle of something if it needed to be repaired, or if we could reprocess or service it. And so we established a process for that with some local manufacturers in coordination with a company from California, Bloom Energy, that had done this for California. A lot of respirator reprocessing or re-sterilization was also conducted here. And so for each of these different product types, there were different requirements from a life cycle standpoint that we were taking into consideration, and then kind of meeting our manufacturers where they were with their capabilities and capacity. One thing that I'll mention, on the ventilators, I talked about the process for servicing them, but the form versus function argument is really important to think about here. Oftentimes in this pandemic response, we really get fixated on a thing, like a ventilator, but ultimately what we're trying to do is treat patients, and in this case, ventilating patients. And so as the pandemic crisis unfolded, yes, we did need ventilators in certain instances, but when we look more holistically at the treatment aspect, we also needed the disposable tubing sets and breathing circuits and filters as well, and sometimes to a larger volume than we needed ventilators. We also needed people that could help intubate patients, and so there was a workforce component and a training component to that. This picture here represents one of the more innovative mask designs that I've seen. When we think about a mask, we often think about what the standard N95 kind of cup-shaped respirator looks like. Well, there's different sizes of those, and it's not only the function of filtering that matters, but the fitting really matters so that you're not leaking air on the sides. And this is a mask that actually has an adhesive strip around it where you can kind of custom fit it and seal it to your face. And so again, if you're just solely thinking about the thing, the form, that can create some limitations in terms of, are you addressing the right problem? I'm going to do a quick run through of nasal pharyngeal swabs. So many of you have likely been tested throughout the last year. If it was early on in the pandemic, it was likely with an NP swab, which I'm sorry if you went through this experience. This can be quite uncomfortable, and it goes all the way back to the back of your nasal cavity. But this was something that was incredibly short in supply in March. And one of the reasons for that is that the two primary manufacturers for this, one of them, Koppen, is in Italy. And Italy was hit very hard with their first wave of the pandemic in March. At this point, the US Air Force started flying missions, bringing, million swabs from the US. The first one in March was March 19th. But then they ran roughly 10 of these between March and early April. And this isn't something that you think of as the primary component for a test, but this is what you get this is what you use for collecting samples. And so that sample collection aspect, and ultimately leading to large volume of testing, we found ourselves very short in supply during the first surge. And so a group here in Massachusetts was formed. Actually, the first meeting was the day before the M-ERT, but started to really look at what could be a bridge strategy that could get us to maybe a time in which these manufacturers are coming back online. And the other manufacturer besides Koppen is Puritan, and they're actually located in Maine. And during this, the Department of Defense provided them with about $125 million to build two new facilities to increase their capacity by about 4x. But that's going to take a certain amount of time. And so we were looking at, what do they do to create these swabs? And flocking of nylon is a critical process to creating these swabs. And we quickly shifted from this. One reason is that it's a relatively intensive process, but there's also an IP battle going on between Puritan and Koppen in the middle of a pandemic. And so quickly realized this wasn't something we were going to be able to spin up very quickly. And the group that was working on this, led by Kit Parker out of the Harvard Wyss Institute and Rick Follup, who's the CEO of Desktop Metal, really pulled together a coalition of industrial 3D printing companies. And it was really initiated by a group out of Beth Israel, Dr. Rami Arnaud, to really look at, how could we address this supply shortage in a different way. And there's a lot of information on this project that's out on the web, but the main takeaways from this is that they were able to leverage the capabilities of these industrial 3D printing companies on their networks who typically make maybe dental or surgical guides that are biocompatible to, within 6 or 7 weeks, iterate and clinically validate swab alternatives. At the same time, as I was helping support this project, we were looking for packaging and sterilization solutions. And so I reached out to my previous company, Applied Medical, who has capabilities to do that on site. They took a different approach and actually in about 6 weeks also iterated through 6 different injection molded swabs to also clinically validate some options. And so the kind of takeaways here is there's an ability to respond quickly in a crisis from an agile manufacturing approach, but it's really tightly coupled with the design side of it as well as the testing piece of it. And so the 3D printing capabilities enable you to do that very quickly because you don't have tooling. However, a company that has a large manufacturing base and vertical integration can also achieve the same thing. Quickly, just to go through this, there's some complexity that was introduced to the demand side and the buyer side from the 3D printing swab. If you have a large network of 3D printing companies now selling the same swabs, it creates a lot of communication connections on the buyer side. So this was one route that some of these companies took. The other route is that a number of 3D printing companies have a network of suppliers, and so they were able to stage their supply chain so that they had the design go to these suppliers. The suppliers could then send printed swabs to a single medical device company that was registered with the FDA to maybe do packaging and sterilization, and then those could go out to different buyers. And this is important from the buyer standpoint because there can be a validation step here for swabs in terms of integrating this into the PCR process. And then lastly is how do you then couple that into terms of design, iteration, and communication again. An additional piece to 3D printing in medical devices that was brought up during this crisis is that the National Institute for Health started a 3D print exchange in coordination with the VA and the FDA. And this was utilized to a certain degree during the crisis, but something that might be leveraged more in the future, where there's a number of existing designs that become somewhat approved or cleared for clinical use that can then be printed directly on site with a health system that maybe has this capability. So for the M-ERT, I went through the test swabs a little bit. The other area that was really, I think, a testament to the Massachusetts manufacturing base is the isolation gown response. Isolation gowns are actually relatively complicated in terms of their regulatory pathway and testing requirements. There's 4 different levels of protection, and so this was an area where we had to find alignment between buyers and what producers could do, and then ultimately figure out what the FDA requirements and pathways were for that. But that was something we were able to do within about 20 days from when we started the M-ERT. And some of this has to do with the head start that a number of manufacturers here in Massachusetts had, in that they started responding on their own, and then we teamed up with them. But by April 9th, our first pivoting manufacturer on gowns had signed a 1 million gown contract with the state from 99 Degrees. We've since had another 5 manufacturers pivot and join here to do large volumes again of disposable isolation gowns as well as reusable isolation gowns. So in total, this impact by volume, by mid-May, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had distributed about 10 million pieces of PPE. In that same time period, M-ERT companies had produced about 2 million pieces of PPE and about 1.5 million pieces, or 1.5 million test swabs. And our overall impact by volume as of late November, about 15 million items of PPE, including face shields, face masks, surgical masks, and respirators, disposable and reusable isolation gowns, amongst other things, had been manufactured by companies here in Massachusetts, in addition to tens of millions of 3D printed swabs from that national collaborative as well. And what you see there in the top right is actually Governor Cuomo from New York, who was swabbed with one of the 3D printed swabs. And these numbers have increased since then. Again, this was late November. And to put this into perspective, FEMA Region 1, which is the Northeast states, had during this same time period distributed about 20 million pieces of PPE. And so the scale of the response, again, maybe starting flat-footed, but with our shoes on, was probably the one that I've seen at the largest scale and maybe most organized across the nation. And at the same time, those were new products. But I mentioned that we were also helping to test and increase the confidence in products that were being imported or donated. And during this time, the testing group of the M-ERT, which included folks from MIT Lincoln Labs, UMass Lowell, and MIT Greg Rutledge's lab, tested 620 unique N95 or KN95 products and materials, 280 surgical masks and materials, and 40 unique medical gowns or products. And that translates to additional millions of products that can be distributed across the Commonwealth. And the numbers tested here compare pretty considerably with what the CDC has been doing during the crisis in looking at counterfeits. In addition to the PPE, the other key metric that I think we were all very happy to see is that during the surge aspect, the first surge, about 1,250 jobs were either created or sustained during this effort. That's continued as more companies have either pivoted or as companies have continued to produce PPE beyond that first surge. So one of the things that I was doing during this time was really to try to make sense of what was going on in the ecosystem. And so as I was identifying either new projects that were coming up either at MIT or elsewhere, I was trying to figure out where the M-ERT fit in relation to this. And so you can think of this as somewhat of the Google Maps view of our crisis response, especially during the first surge. If you want to explore this model, this is linked on the SDM website. It hasn't been updated in a little while, so it is out of date, but I will, I think really reflects our first surge response, and not just the PPE response, but other aspects in the greater, the Massachusetts ecosystem and some of the key stakeholders during this. I mentioned we focused a lot on the supply side of this challenge. The demand side has been as complex, if not more complicated. And one of the reasons for that is that the demand for PPE outside of the health system is actually a lot larger than within the health system. And we worked with a team at MIT Lincoln Labs who put together, an 18-month model looking at different types of PPE that we would need within a hospital, right? But then with police, fire, EMT, long-term care, and home personal care. This doesn't include schools or other key sub-communities, but you can see the volume of N95 masks, gloves, surgical masks, and gowns that are required. And this team's looking to improve and expand this model nationally. But I would say, we've been able to pivot and cover a certain amount of this, but not to the extent of what the needs and demands are. And there were some products like gloves, nitrile gloves, that require a huge CapEx investment and very specific manufacturing capabilities that we weren't able to pivot to. And this also has introduced some challenges from the buyer side in general for getting PPE. So we have all these manufacturers that are pivoting to create different types of PPE. And we have a lot of different buyers, right? And this creates, again, that noise of trying to find the right products. And there's a huge learning curve for what types of protection you're looking for, what products can actually achieve that. And the challenge with this is that not all buyers are necessarily created equal. They don't have the same procurement resources, whether it's staff, whether it's actually purchasing power. And so what we really see are, large group purchasing organizations or large health systems, but then we have small elder care facilities where you may have an individual that's responsible for procurement. And so there's a mismatch of being able to actually find some of these new manufacturers or having buying power to actually have large enough orders to help sustain some of these new manufacturers. So there's still opportunities here. And I think this is an area of crisis response that's still being worked through because a lot of times these smaller groups get lost in the noise, or they don't have enough resources or support to actually find some of these new capabilities. And there's also, unfortunately, a lot of counterfeiting that's been going on during the pandemic. So an area that potentially could be improved is looking at, how do you maybe decouple these large buyers from the smaller ones and help to pool their purchasing power and resources through maybe a third party that could that could help with the operational learning curve side of these materials, but also kind of pool their purchasing power. And I know I'm coming up here towards 45 minutes. I have a whole nother section that I won't go through today, but where we're at with the M-ERT is looking at how does all of this come together. And so we actually are working on a rapid execution for scaling and looking at how this process, what can we learn from the M-ERT and maybe leverage for a future crisis response and manufacturing agility. And a research collaborative that's come from the M-ERT was recently awarded an NSF grant to do this work. And we're working on some other proposals as well. But keep an eye out for this. There's an article in the MIT News about it. But we think that there's a lot of learnings that can come from this that could be leveraged proactively for other ecosystem needs, but also for future crises. In addition to this, working with Professor Hart and Hayden Quinlan on a MIT X course called Manufacturing Agility and Crisis Response, where we'll have interviews with a lot of the different folks that I met that I talked about these projects and work from, so keep an eye out for that. And then there's also one of the organizations that we've been working with on the M-ERT has put together a short docuseries of which that opening clip was from, called Project Frontline, and they actually have their second episode coming out this Thursday, February 11th from 7 to 8 p.m. So if you're interested in learning more and hearing directly from the manufacturers that responded, this is a great way to hear their story. And as I mentioned, that was sort of the first half of the work that I did. I've been doing a lot in the testing and contact tracing side of things with the group from Harvard, the Global Health Institute, the Brown School of Public Health, and the Soffer Center for Ethics. But I don't think I have time to go through this set. So potentially if there's interest, we can do a follow-up on this one, but very much taking that systems thinking approach, but more towards a public health system process. I'll scroll through these slides real quick so folks can see them, and I'll get to the end of the kind of conclusion of this. But a lot more kind of operational logistics aspects to testing and contact tracing. And some of the testing that's now being kicked off today actually in the state for our K through 12 schools in the recent vaccine rollout. Just one thing I'd like to talk about in terms of vaccines is an analogy that I found to be very useful is the term herd autonomy. And in context of a mobility system, you can layer this, the idea of having enough autonomous vehicles on the road to keep everybody safe. It's going to be a while before we get there, right? But you need autonomous vehicles. In the meantime, still use GPS and traffic information to look for accidents and where you should or should not go. Stay in your lane, right, to avoid collisions. If an intersection, if there's a green light at an intersection but it's already full, maybe don't enter. And then your crumple zones, airbags, and seatbelts keep you safe if there's an accident. Herd immunity, right? The same sort of an analogy here, structures the same way, right? Vaccines is autonomous vehicles. That's the technology that's going to help to get us to a point where we have enough people inoculated to keep us safe. But in the meantime, get tested if you need to and leverage our testing data for infection information. Continue to physical distance. Avoid indoor-outdoor gatherings if there's too many people there. And ventilation, PPE, and hand washing is the equivalent of crumple zones, airbags, and seatbelts. And so all of these things together is what are going to get us through this. It's not one that's a silver bullet. So just in closing, COVID is very much a human connected problem. There's a lot of work left to do. There are no silver bullets. And from my personal experience, there's a tremendous power in cohesive collaboration through systems leadership. And so I encourage those of you that have experience in systems thinking and systems design to really consider how you may be able to support efforts like this or other efforts in your community, especially as we get into economic redevelopment. Just lastly, a big thank you to a really long list of collaborators and volunteers and those that are continuing to lead this response across Massachusetts and the US. One thing for me is really looking at the number of people that you can meet working from home across the state in the US is incredible. And so there's a lot of obviously technology that goes into helping us stay connected. But I'm very much hopeful and optimistic about what those relationships can bring once we get out of this crisis and what we can do proactively going forward. So I'll stop there, Naomi, for questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was fascinating. I know that I've heard a little bit of what you've been working on over the past 11 months, just by virtue of being in your department, but I definitely always find that there's more to find out. It looks like we do have some questions coming in. One request for the ops logistics take on testing when we're able. So we can definitely talk about setting that up in the future. We have a question from Ava Laraka, who is a MEC-E student figuring out how to make an impact with their degree. And they ask if you have suggestions for courses to take or skills or experiences one could acquire while in school to prepare for real-world jobs like yours. I feel like the easy answer there is to join system design and management, but I'm sure you have more specific thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I did mechanical engineering as an undergrad, and one of the things when I got to industry that I learned is that, design is only a portion of really solving the problem. And for me, I always found it incredibly valuable to go out into the field and in this case, watch a surgery, see how people actually interact with the system and try to, stay connected to the actual place you're trying to have an impact. But there's a tremendous amount of activity that needs to go on in between the design to actually getting it to the field. And so there's a series of problems that need to be solved from that life cycle standpoint. And so I think that's where, if you can find either courses, and if you want to follow up, I think my email was at the beginning. I had that course last week. I'm happy to send you some recordings from that, but really understanding more of sort of that multidisciplinary approach of all the inputs that are required and efforts required to bring a device to market or to, whatever impact you're trying to have. Understanding, that in this case, and in the context of COVID, our impact wasn't going to be that we designed a new respirator or that we designed a new swab, right? We needed the physical thing and it needed to perform, an FDA compliant, function or meet their expectations for quality. And so understanding where your goalpost is, right? And I think oftentimes in an academic setting, sometimes the design piece of it gets weighed a lot. But in this case, we really needed the manufacturing piece of that. And I think that's where, when you look at our specific effort, we started and anchored on manufacturers that had capacity. And, we were able to augment that capacity with other subject matter expertise. And so the other area I would say is if you are interested in, mechanical or electrical devices, is learn more about the manufacturing process. And again, how your design can influence those processes and how those processes can influence your design, because there's a lot of feedback there.
That's a very thorough answer. Thank you. We have a few questions about kind of how to get a background in systems design and systems thinking as an introduction. For those people, I would actually recommend checking the archives of this webinar series. They are all available on our YouTube channel. A question from Charles Kramer, who asks, was the increased volume of medical waste a consideration?
Yeah, I would say, as we got further into it, that was something we were looking at more of. And I think the extending the life cycle of certain products was partly from a sustainability standpoint, but also partly from having a limited supply. We did see more and more designs coming that were reusable or maybe re-sterilizable, reprocessable, and we were supporting some of those newer designs with that same life cycle support, especially with testing. So there's been a number of reusable type respirator masks that we tested some of their filtration media or looked at how to help support them from the design standpoint. But in terms of that initial pivot standpoint, we really needed a high volume of this. And so that wasn't part of our, first surge type of effort. But I think going forward, especially when we're looking at this from a proactive standpoint, and, ideally we don't have another pandemic in our lifetime. However, we should prepare for one. what can we do to actually innovate on a lot of these products, right? Because some of these they're commodities, highly engineered commodities during normal times, but I think there's a big opportunity to think about, what are some of the other problems that we've introduced and how can we solve for those? And sustainability and waste is one of those.
I think that's a very good point, and especially as far as forward planning, even within the current pandemic, we're looking at changes in, for instance, double masking being recommended instead of a single mask, or upgrading your masks to include better filtration. So that kind of thing is definitely going to have an impact as we plan for the future. We have a question from Norris Tulloch, which is, what are some of the pain points encountered in the process?
Yeah, for me personally, I think there's the impact that everybody's feeling in this. And, I have now he's 21 months old, but my son was 11 months when this started. And so my wife and I balancing 2 jobs, work from home, and I'm not complaining. We're very fortunate to be able to be in a position to work from home. And I got the support from SDM to pursue this mostly full time during the first surge, but balancing and trying, in this case, harmonize, right? My wife's full-time job, this effort, and also ensuring that my son's well taken care of were challenging. So that's on the personal side. I think from the group side of this, there was just the situation was so dynamic, and there was so much learning going on. Not only as what is COVID, how is it transmitted, right? How are they treating patients in the hospital? How is the FDA changing their regulations? How can some of these manufacturers, they may have a certain process, how could we leverage that? And so there was just so much kind of parallelized learning that trying to keep up with all of that was really difficult. And I would say that's where, again, this kind of systems leadership approach of, we had, people that were dedicated to these different parts of the life cycle. We also took a kind of product manager approach to some of these where we could help have people really focus on deep dive into the product. And so there was just so much information. I think that was really one of the most challenging parts to it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's been a real crash course for everybody over the past 11 months or so, or even longer, really, in areas that we might not have ever thought about. I think we have time for about one more question. So this one is from Isabel C., which I think kind of ties into what you were saying just now, asking, what's the best way to achieve good communication among professionals from different disciplines?
Yeah, so I'll draw on some of my experience coming from the med device industry. Again, the company I worked at, I helped build out an embedded systems division, and we were primarily mechanical focused. And that's really what I think drove some of the direction I took my thesis with SDM, was understanding how these disciplines come together and you build trust. And one of the really big things here around this effort, and I think also from what I did in industry, is that everybody has different contexts, right? Everybody's kind of mental image of something might be informed differently. And so really connecting people again to that end goal. And so we had the chief of medicine, Dr. Zaidel from Beth Israel, and he was giving us updates 3 times a week of to where things were, how they were using PPE. And that really helped, I think, align everybody as to the context of the problem we were solving. And then I think the other one with that is, that alignment in the context and the frequency of which we're communicating with one another and thinking about what everybody's bringing to the table were really critical in that. So I think that to me was one of the biggest aspects to this. But there's really a translational piece, again, that happens between different domains that can be challenging. But the other one for med device specifically is where all of that kind of meets is in risk management and how you're mitigating hazards, especially for patients or users. And you can mitigate hazards a lot of different ways: mechanical design, electrical, software, etc. And ultimately, which one you choose isn't as important as the fact that people are safe and that your products are effective. But there's trade-offs in all of those. And so I think that's really where these FDA documents in this case highlighted these are the critical hazards that you're mitigating with tests for the filtration efficiency, et cetera. right? The clinical context and the hazards you're mitigating really were at the center of what we were doing. And people were saying, with my expertise, we could do it this way or this way, right? There's trade-offs for which one you choose, but getting everybody synced on that kind of risk and clinical vocabulary and perspective were really important.
Well, thank you again, Ben, for taking the time to share your experiences and your expertise with us. I think this is really interesting to a wide variety of people, and so I appreciate you taking the time. And to all our attendees, thank you for joining us today. This presentation's recording will be available online once we're finished. And I hope you can join us for our next webinar, which will be on March 16th with Caitlin Mueller, who's the Associate Professor in MIT School of Architecture. On behalf of the System Design and Management Program, thank you for joining us.